If you're looking for a lure that'll catch fish under all types of conditions, a lure that's tournament proven and not just another gimmick, then you've come to the right place. Because the Eakins Pro Model Jig is just what you're looking for. The design of the Eakins Jig is a result of years of testing by 1993 Bassmaster's Classic Qualifier, Jim Eakins and his son Troy. During the past 5 years, Jim and Troy have won over $250,000 in bass tournament competition against some of the best bass fishermen in America. And they've done it fishing their secret weapon, the Eakins Pro Model Jig. Now, they've reached an agreement with Jewel Bait Company to market the lure and give anglers everywhere the benefit of their experience. If you're saying to yourself, hey, all jigs are alike, then maybe it's time to think again. All jigs are not alike. And one of the reasons Jim and Troy Eakins have enjoyed such success is because Jim spent nearly a decade designing this jig to get it exactly the way he wanted it.
Probably 10 years ago, I started keeping a lot of records on how a fish bit the jig, where the fish was hooked at, and started recognizing that you get more bites on a smaller jig. It seemed to me like the fish were going more to smaller baits and they were larger baits. I probably made somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 8 different molds before I got this jig perfected the way I wanted it to be. I determined from fishing it and from all the records that the lighter jig, the fall speed, the line size, different things like that made all the difference in the world about how the fish would bite the jig. The round-headed jig, after a long period of time, we determined would come through the brush and through the rocks better than any other design. There's a lot of other heads out that will come through certain things better. The little round-headed jig will come through the brush and the rocks and come over limbs better than any other head.
In Eakins' view, most jigs were simply too heavy. Now, heavy is fine if you're crawling a jig along the bottom or flipping it into heavy cover. But Eakins realized he sometimes got jig strikes as the lure was falling, and he reasoned that if he could slow the fall and make it as natural as possible, he'd get even more strikes.
You wanted the jig to fall through the water as lifelike as could be. I've been raised on a river. I've watched crawdads in the water all my life. I've watched them move through the water, and I wanted the jig to move through the water or fall through the water as much like a crawdad as could be. So we balanced the jig in a manner to make it fall lifelike. And one of the reasons for using the lighter line is it helps the jig fall more lifelike.
Every element of the Eakins Pro Model Jig has been tested in tournament competition. And Jim's preference for the round, ball-shaped head, cross-eye configuration, and the must-add ultra-point black nickel hook are the result of hours and hours on the water. The jig only comes in one size, however, 5/16 of an ounce. And as you might expect, Jim had good reasons for that decision.
When I designed the jig, we determined that fall speed and lifelike presentation was the most important part of it, and I made several different molds, making 1/4 ounce jigs, 3/8 ounce jigs, and several different sizes between. But we settled down on the 5/16 ounce size because it fell more lifelike and acted a lot more like a crawdad than any other bait that we put in the water. So we have made only the one size of jig, and we fish the one size of jig. The 5/16 ounce size jig is the only size that I think you really need. And to change the fall speed of it a little bit, just change line size. You can go to a 10-pound line. Sometimes we'll even go down to an 8-pound line to let the jig fall a little faster. But you go on up to 17 or 20-pound test line, the jig will fall a little slower, and sometimes the fish are in a mood for just a little bit slower fall jig. Well, several years ago, when I was fishing the BASS tournaments, we got to discussing amongst a lot of the guys the way that the eye set in a jig, and when I was keeping records about where the fish was hooked at, I got on this cross eye thing, and from keeping records and noticing wherever fish that I caught was hooked at, you would have a much higher percentage of hooking the fish in the top hard part of the mouth if you had the cross eye. And then I got to playing with the jig, bringing it through pieces of obstacles laying on a workbench or something like that, and noticed that the jig would not turn and hook a piece of structure near as well if you had the cross eye.
One key to achieving the proper natural fall speed is line size and line diameter. A jig falls faster and more vertically on lighter line, and that's a factor Jim and Troy Eakins always keep in mind.
The diameter of the line, it has a tremendous effect on the fall speed of the jig. And you want your jig to have a straight down presentation on a light, slack line. You want to have as light an entry in the water as possible, but you need to put the jig where the fish may be. If the fish is close to the bank, if the fish is in rocks, wherever it's at, you want that jig close to where that fish is at. The jig falling through the water and the impulse strike comes from the bass seeing the jig fall from the sky, from the surface of the water, and it comes down as a silhouette. That's why in the darker waters you would want to fish a little darker jig. In the clearer waters you'd want to fish a little lighter colored jig. But the silhouette of the jig falling through the water is what makes the bass want to strike it. And it needs to come in from the surface nice and quiet.
What I feel like is the most important thing about fishing the jig is the vertical presentation. When you pitch the jig up to the boat dock or the log or the stump or whatever you're fishing, you cannot pitch the jig in and let it fall away from the piece of cover. You've got to let it fall in front of the fish. And the only way to do that is the slack line. You've got to let the jig fall through the bottom. The big part about jig fishing is detecting the bite. And you get so many more bites on this jig that it's easier to learn how to detect the fish, biting your jig, whether he's picking it up and holding it or swimming off, or you just get more bites on it. So for the beginner, it's easier to learn with this jig than anything else.
If the Eakins were careful about designing the jig, they were also particular about the design of the Eakins Pro Model Crawl. It's just the right size, with the right action and the right profile. Not only does it move through the water the way the Eakins wanted, it's also saturated with salt and has a rough exterior, so it would taste and feel real to a bass.
The Eakins Pro is just the perfect size. It matches the jig real well. It comes in all different colors. Of course, preferably what I fish is the brown, the green pumpkin, the root beer. When it's sitting on the bottom in clear water, you'd think that it was a crawdad. I've never seen anything that imitates a crawdad, the way you work it, the way the jig falls, the way the crawdad looks in the water. I've never seen anything that looks more like a crawdad.
You can work the Eakins Pro Model Jig around any type of cover or structure. Boat docks, in the bushes, along logs and stumps, through grass, even deep along ledge rock banks.
The jig can be fished in rocky conditions, it can be fished in deep water, it can be fished in bushes, it can be fished in colored water. Any kind of condition that you want, the little jig is a great jig for that. In dirtier water or in a bush where you need to use a heavier line to fish it, the jig will work fine. You want it to fall slower through a bush, so a heavier line will work fine. If you're going to fish a jig in a bush, the idea of fishing in a bush in the first place is that the fish is down in the bush. So you want to place the jig over and in the bush to where it goes straight down through the bush. And here again, you need some pretty good line to do this with. So whenever that fish bites that jig, you can hit him pretty good and bring him up through the big limbs in the bottom of the bush and up into the smaller limbs in the top in one motion, so you can boat him pretty quick. Here again, you want to put the jig in the water as light as you can, very small splash, and put it in close to the area that you feel like the fish is in. And the fish should be in the dark area on the log. Wherever you're seeing the shadow on the log, wherever there's a limb coming off a log, or where you've got two rocks together, you can go between the two rocks. If there's a sparse bush there, you can put it into the base of the bush, wherever the dark area is at, and put the jig in and make it fall straight down into that area. Because the fish is sitting there and it's an impulse strike, and the jig needs to come in from over his head right down where he can strike it.
The Eakins Pro Model Jig works especially well around boat docks, where its lifelike profile and natural fall are designed to draw a reaction strike from a bass, even one that's not intent on feeding.
Well, this jig is probably it's my go-to bait when I fish boat docks or fish just about anything, especially boat docks. It seems like the fish really bite it well around docks. It's the right size. It falls well. You can change your line size to make it fall. It's just the right bait to fish around the dock. It comes over the cables real well. There's lots of obstructions around boat docks. It seems like a lot of the other jigs that want to hang when this jig doesn't.
The Eakins Pro Model Jig is often called a finesse jig, primarily because of its compact profile and lightweight head. And compared to large jigs that look like they're made for piercing battleship armor, the Eakins Jig is small. But make no mistake, it draws more strikes than bigger jigs, and from big bass, too.
All fish will hit this jig. I've caught, lots of keeper-sized fish. I've caught a lot of 5 and 6 pound fish, and in fact, I caught one a little over 11 at Lake of the Ozarks. But the big fish will hit this jig just like the little fish will. This part about the big jig, big fish, I don't think a lot of that's true. I think this jig looks so good in the water. I've never seen anything imitate a crawdad as well as what this jig does. And I think that's why all the fish bite it real well.
Rigging the Eakins Pro Model Jig, just like Jim and Troy, is as easy as 1, 2, 3. First, you slide the color of skirt you want onto the jig. Make sure the short end of the skirt is around the head of the jig. Next, remove 2 tail segments from the Eakins craw to make it the right length for the jig. Now, hold the skirt down to expose the hook and slide the craw onto the hook so the hook will eventually emerge from the top of the craw. Push the craw past the barb on the body of the jig, keeping the hook in the center until it exits on the reference spot between the eyes. Now, take a pair of scissors and trim the weed guard. It can be any length you choose, but Troy places his scissors along the top of the hook and cuts straight across, a length that's long enough for him to pull the jig through cover, but short enough that he can set the hook effectively. When you're done, the finished lure should look like this. So you can see how lifelike the Eakins Pro Model Jig falls and how much it resembles a live crawdad in the water, we went to a freshwater aquarium with natural habitat. As you can see, the Eakins Pro Model Jig is hard to tell from a real crawdad, even for the bass and other game fish. Now you have to remember this is an artificial situation, and you can't expect to catch a fish on every cast the way Jim did for this video. What's important is that you can see how he works the lure and have confidence that it will catch fish. By now, you can see the Eakins Pro Model Jig is part of a complete fish-catching system that enables you to combine a jig head, skirt, and craw to create the color combination that's right for almost any situation. The Eakins Pro Model Jig comes in brown and black heads with matching fiber weed guard. The Eakins Jig system also includes 10 colors of skirts and the Eakins Pro Model Craw in 6 colors. You can buy the Eakins Pro Model Jig and Eakins Pro Model Craws separately, or they come as part of a complete kit that includes 6 jig heads, 10 skirts, and 4 plastic craws. The Clearwater kit contains jigs, skirts, and craws in shades of brown and green, while the Stained Water kit contains both black and brown. You'll find them right here, along with a complete selection of Jewel Bait Company's other fish-catching lures. To show you the impact of the Eakins Pro Model Jig, let's take a look at 2 of the tournaments Jim and Troy Eakins have won using it. The first is at Lake of the Ozarks in March of 1998. On a cold, rainy first day, Jim Eakins came in with a remarkable 26 pounds, the second highest one-day catch in Central Pro-Am history, all caught on the Eakins Pro Model Jig. But he wasn't alone. All of the top 4 anglers at the end of the first day were members of the Jewel Pro staff.
Well, I started the day off intending to fish like 15 different banks. And I got on a couple of the banks and the fish got to biting real good, so I stayed with 2 banks most of the day. I was up the Osage. I caught all my fish on the jig. I caught them all in 4 to 5 foot of water. We was lucky that the rain held off. Really, the big fish bit just a little while before the rain started. I caught somewhere in the neighborhood of 15, 16 keepers today, but I was lucky enough to cull them all out with 4-pounders.
On the final day, the weather was more of the same, with a blizzard headed down from the north. Some of the leaders fell out of contention, but Jim continued to catch fish. His 18 pounds on the second day gave him 44 pounds in 2 days and a 10-pound edge over his closest rival. And who was that? You guessed it, Troy, who finished second with over 34 pounds, meaning the Eakins Pro Model Jig accounted for nearly 80 pounds of bass in 2 days. The next year, it was Troy's turn at Lake of the Ozarks. Although Tim Sonato took the early lead with 15 pounds, Troy came in with a limit that weighed over 20 pounds and established the day one lead. Then the weather changed.
On the morning of day 2, the weather forecasts have proved right. A cold front moved through during the night, shifting the wind to the northwest and dropping overnight temperatures dramatically, both factors that could affect the fishing. Day 1 leader Troy Eakins starts the day along ledges and coves near the Niangua arm of the lake. He's getting plenty of strikes, but so far all the fish are small. In the past 2 years, the patient, determined Eakins has emerged as one of the best jig fishermen in mid-America. And Lake of the Ozarks, with its stained water and shallow boat docks, suits his style to a T.
By the time Troy came to the scales to weigh in, the lead had jumped to 31 pounds, and the crowd was on edge, wondering if Troy could come through under such tough conditions.
How many we got? He has the limit, $12,500 on the line, leading the tournament right now, 31.70. Get out, get out. 18.35 pounds, 38.95 pounds. A new leader in the pro division, Troy Eakins.
Finally, there's only one more thing you need to see, and that's proof positive that the Eakins Pro Model Jig will catch big fish and do it when it counts most. On the final day of the 1999 Pro-Am Championship at Table Rock Lake, Troy was certain he needed a big fish to win. With only 3 hours to go, he went looking where he knew there were big fish, armed only with his flipping stick and an Eakins Pro Model Jig. Sure enough, Troy got the fish he needed, a solid 5-pounder that enabled him to win the $40,000 first prize. Put the tournament-proven power of the Eakins Pro Model Jig on your side. The results speak for themselves.